In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. That's from the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution. And it makes sense. Our criminal justice system is complex, and the government, in pursuing a criminal conviction, has many resources and deep legal expertise. Yet even today, though we have public defenders, it's hard to say we've universally met this ideal, but we still could. Today we discuss the role of the public defender and the invaluable, though often undervalued role they play in our legal system. This is the ABA Law Student Podcast. Hi, Shay. Hi, Manny. How are you doing?
Hey, Todd. Doing good.
Everything's good. Finals are coming up. Holidays are coming up. Things are coming up. So more and more we're winding down, getting closer and closer to May and graduation, which, I'm going to mention that every episode because I'm super excited.
Speaking of things that are coming up, you have an interview with a really amazing guest, someone who is a legend within the public defender community. So who are we going to talk to today, Shay?
We are going to talk to co-founder of Gideon's Promise, Professor Jonathan Rapping. And I'm really excited for you all to hear more about Gideon's Promise. He's going to break down so much for us and really talk about his passion for the work of public defense and also what Gideon's Promise does in terms of their training with public defenders across the country.
And what made you want to talk to Professor Rapping, Shay?
Actually, Professor Rapping, it was a big part of my orientation into law school. So I thought that it would be a full circle moment for me to talk to him as I'm exiting law school and talk to him honestly as someone who now has more knowledge about what he was talking about. Because, during an orientation, you don't ever know what someone is really talking about and your brain is scattered and you're just honestly still surprised that they let you in the building. So now that they're letting me leave the building, I wanted to speak with Professor Rapping and learn more about his expertise, more about some of the work that he's done outside of kind of that straight up and down being in a courtroom and how he's worked to impact the legal field. Because I feel like sometimes my generation can be a little ignorant to the fact that you do have to put in the work to make that broader impact. You can't be a mogul at day one. You have to be able to lay the foundation brick by brick. And Professor Jonathan Rapping's story and his career has shown how you can do that, how he continues to do that, and how he's still making his mark on the industry.
It's terrific. So a lot there for our listeners, whether they're just entered practice or they're thinking about what field they're going to go into, to really unpack as we get into this interview. So let's get started.
Professor, what qualities in a person tend to lend them to pursuing a career as a public defender?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the public defenders I know are really the best lawyers I know. The first thing is a real seriousness about being excellent in the craft because you have to have the tools to fight this battle. But being a great lawyer, knowing the law, having a set of skills isn't enough. I think really to be a public defender, you have to possess empathy, compassion, the ability to care about people that no one else cares about, the ability to see people for who they are beyond the worst moment in their life, understanding that while you're in spaces where people are labeled as thieves and robbers and abusers, you see them as mothers and fathers, sons, daughters, shopkeepers, caregivers, community members. Remembering the humanity of people is a critical thing to do as a public defender.
How do you think that can be refined as you kind of grow up and life tends to harden you? What can a person do to stay tapped into that humanity and that empathy?
I usually, when I meet law students for the first time in orientation, I will ask the group, why are you here? What brought you to law school? And law students usually have very idealistic answers. I want to address this particular cause, or I want to work with this particular community of people who are vulnerable. And then I share with them a quote from an unnamed law student that says, the first thing I lost in law school is the reason why I came. And I tell them, you're about to enter a first year where you are going to learn the law through the casebook method. We will reduce the law to black letters on a white page, to rules and doctrine. And before you know it, you may forget that there are human beings behind these cases. And I challenge the first year students. I say, I challenge any of you to come to me after your first year and share with me the story of one person you met through the dozens and dozens of cases that you will study this year. And I've never had a student who's able to do it, because really the way we teach law students is we teach them to think like lawyers. It's a rational, analytic process. And while that's critically important, there is a danger that we are unintentionally stripping the humanity from them. So what I say to law students is, as important as learning the law, as important as learning the ability to analyze, you've got to figure out your purpose and find a way to nurture it and hold on to it throughout your time in law school. And that comes from working with people who can be role models and mentors, finding ways to get experience in spaces where the people you want to serve are impacted, so you can come to see them as people and not just case studies. It's being present, it's being involved, it's stepping outside of the law school experience, the professional lawyering experience, and not forgetting the human being that you brought with you into that educational environment.
What happened to you in your law school experience that made you want to go into public defense?
Yeah, so I came out of college. Again, I wanted to be a defense lawyer. I came out of college, and everyone I talked to told me that if I went to law school, I was going to incur incredible debt and I wouldn't be able to do the work I love. I'd get tracked into some career that was driven by my need to make money to pay off my debt. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Why would I put those shackles on myself? And I worked for a couple of years. I got a master's degree. And I realized in those 4 years that I hadn't found anything that would fulfill me, that nothing excited me like that dream of being a defense lawyer. So I bit the bullet. I came to law school. I incurred a lot of debt, like most law students. And in my first summer, the summer between my first and second year, I interned at the Washington, D.C. Public Defender Service, which I didn't know at the time, but is a model public defender office. And I met these amazing mostly young lawyers who were so passionate, so spirited. They loved their clients. They loved the work. They were a group of colleagues who saw themselves as collectively fighting to make sure that civil rights were preserved and racial and economic justice was realized. They were superheroes to me. And I thought to myself, that's what I want to do. And I spent my entire second year of law school, my second summer, my third year of law school, continuing to intern at that public defender office. I made myself a feature there. They couldn't not hire me. And that's what led me into public defense.
Do you think it is almost a disservice to yourself if you come out of law school and don't try to get training from either a public defender's office or the district attorney's office, because you all put a new lawyer through the training that they really need to be competent to practice? I've heard that so many times, that like these two offices in any state will really give you the best training so that you feel competent to really go out and help your clients. I just want to get your take on that, being a trainer as well.
Yeah. So Shay, I'm always conflicted when I answer this question, because I absolutely think you cannot be an excellent lawyer if you aren't in a space initially where you learn how to practice law. And there are very few places where you can really serve people, be in courtrooms if you want to be a trial lawyer, and practice law. Public defense is absolutely one of those spaces. The reason I say I'm conflicted about that question is because I also think it is really important that we not have people who have historically not had access to justice have their life and liberty dependent on recent law school graduates who see them as someone to train on. I think it is not a place to go if your view is, I'm not committed to serving people. I want trial experience folks who are vulnerable are not instruments to be practiced on. I would urge people to only do this work if that's your commitment, that's your passion, that's your mission. But if it is, I am with you. You cannot become the best lawyer you can be without that experience.
So let's talk about Gideon's Promise then, your brainchild, and what you've built and how you've built it. I know that when we first virtually met, you talked about Gideon's Promise. Briefly, I still didn't fully understand what it was. And at the time, you were talking about your new book. I remember getting off of the call and I talked to my mentor. Her name was Rose Love. I said to Rose, who's Gideon and what did he promise? Like, I was like, I'm trying to Google it. I don't understand. Who is this Gideon? And so then Rose and I had a conversation. But can you talk to our listeners about Gideon's Promise, your brainchild?
Yeah, so let me first answer the question, who's Gideon and what did he promise? So in 1963, the Supreme Court decided the case of Gideon versus Wainwright. Clarence Earl Gideon was just a man who was accused of breaking into a pool hall, stealing some beverages and some change. And he was in Florida at the time. There was no right to a lawyer for that kind of offense. He went to trial, represented himself, was convicted and sentenced to prison. And he wrote a letter to the Supreme Court saying, this isn't fair. And the Supreme Court agreed. They treated that as a writ of cert, which is what initiates a case in the Supreme Court. And ultimately, with one of the best lawyers in the land, Gideon won his case. And the Supreme Court announced in Gideon versus Wainwright that anyone accused of a crime, a felony, later extended to misdemeanors and juveniles, anyone accused of a crime has a right to have a lawyer. So Gideon is the person who the case is named after. The promise is that everyone will have a lawyer, but not just a lawyer, the kind of lawyer that we would pay for if we had money. And so Gideon's Promise is an organization that works with public defender organizations to create an army of lawyers that the Gideon case promised, but it's a promise that have never been fulfilled.
Gideon's Promise, you all provide training that covers how to challenge forensics of drug cases and defendant confessions, how to use technology to build a defense strategy, how not to be undone by the stresses of the job. Are those things that are not currently taught in public defenders' offices?
So that really depends on the office. There are a number of offices that enjoy well-deserved reputations for providing excellent training and support and mentorship. Disproportionately, those offices are in the Northeast or on the West Coast, and those offices are able to do that because they tend to have more resources. And so with resources, you have the ability to attract people that want to really do the work, to provide them training and supervision. But in far too many offices, even the most basic lessons are not being taught. Not because of some shortcoming of the people running those offices, but they don't have the resources. They're overwhelmed with cases. They have people who don't have lawyers and they need to just get lawyers assigned to them. And so new lawyers might walk in and be given a stack of cases and told, go do your job. And we pretend that somehow in law school you learned how to do that. Fact is, in law school, very rarely do we teach people how to be good practicing lawyers.
One thing that I would be, I think, judged if I don't bring this up is, the lack of resources when we talk about what happens in a public defender's office. The lack of resources also translates to a lot of attorneys, a lot of students, and the general layperson is the lack of money as well, that there is like a hurdle of adequate compensation when you act as a public defender. And something that I think really highlighted that for me again this year was during the YSL case, when a contractor with the public defender's office filed a motion to withdraw from the case due to a loss of livelihood stemming from her role in the case. She had already lost her office, and the money that they were offering her to sit on a case for so long, it just wasn't going to be enough. How hard is it to overcome that hurdle of compensation when you are training these different public defenders that come to your office? Is that a conversation that you all have, and how is it impacting these attorneys?
Yeah, we definitely have it. It's definitely impacting lawyers. I think the anecdote you brought up about the court-appointed counsel who had to shut down her practice, I think our failure to adequately compensate lawyers is really just a reflection of how little we care about the people they serve. We don't really take seriously the promise to give them the kinds of lawyers that you and I would pay for if we had the resources. To me, that story is exactly the problem, that Gideon has a promise, but we don't care about the people who have been targeted and funneled into the system. So I do think for a law student coming out of law school, and I really appreciate this is a very real challenge. Law students, most of you have incredible debt. Many law students, I mean, what I love about John Marshall are our students. John Marshall, as you know, it's a unique population of students, disproportionately first-generation college graduates, let alone law students. Disproportionately, we have students who come from communities that have been impacted by injustice because of race, because of economics. And so I think it can be hard for a student to do the work they want to do when money isn't there. What I would say is this, though: don't undervalue what it means to wake up every day living your purpose. Don't undervalue what it means to be able to model the lessons you teach your children if you're a parent. Now, you got to be able to put food on the table. You have to be able to eat. But I think in this day and age, sometimes young lawyers think, well, no, if I'm going to be a lawyer, I don't just want to eat. I need filet mignon every day. And I don't just want a car. I need a Tesla or whatever it is. And I think that if you're committed to this work, you can find a place where you can make a living that will allow you to be comfortable and you can do the work that is important to you. Don't not do the work without adequately thinking about what you give up when you give up living your purpose.
We'll be right back.
I got to ask you a pop culture-y question that I feel like you would know. So this YSL case has kind of propelled Brian Steele to be a bit of a household name in a lot of urban communities, and especially urban communities that have access to TikTok and things like that. Is this similar? Do you think, I've been thinking about this the past week, is this similar, do you think, to how a lot of households may have felt about Johnnie Cochran back in the OJ days?
Well, that's a great question. So I've got to say this. I mean, I think that for people who know Brian Steele, we appreciate what he brings to this profession and the level of excellence that he models. I'm glad that now people are seeing that. Whether it's Johnnie Cochran level, that's an interesting question. Johnnie Cochran is such a hero, but also O.J. Simpson was such a unique case. Not that this trial wasn't unique, but O.J. Simpson, there's not a person of my generation who can't tell you where they were when that verdict was handed down. And the other thing about the O.J. case is it really exposed for the nation the racial divide when it comes to attitudes about the criminal legal system. Disproportionately, not exclusively, but disproportionately, white America felt like O.J. got away with murder. And I think disproportionately, whether Black Americans thought O.J. did it or not, they understood that Johnnie Cochran was wrenching justice out of a system that never worked for them. That case was a game changer. I will say, though, that I think Brian Steele models everything that Johnnie Cochran talked about in being a great lawyer. And I think Brian Steele is certainly a lawyer in the vein of what Johnnie Cochran imagined great lawyers would be.
I think, when you mentioned that racial component, of the OJ case, do you think that this current case, this YSL case, had a similar ring to it when the focus was on using rap lyrics?
I definitely do. Because I think, obviously rap lyrics are a form of expression. Disproportionately, used by a certain population of people, young, Black, mostly men, but young Black people. And it's the same population that is often, because of our implicit biases, seen as dangerous, as criminal. And I think that the decision to prosecute this case, but also to use RICO, which is such a broad theory of criminal liability, it captures people for the smallest involvement and punishes them significantly. I think this is really an example of how prosecutors can participate in demonizing populations of people and using the weapons in their arsenal to go after them with force that is disproportionate to the harm that comes to society. And when we look at the outcome of the case, you have to ask yourself, is it worth using all those resources for a probationary term? We can look at the same RICO theory that was used against teachers in the Atlanta public school case, where there were teachers who had never been in trouble before, who were accused of cheating, which happens all over the country. Cheating isn't even a crime, right? The crimes were more related to how making false statements or allegations that these teachers weren't forthcoming during the investigation. And then that got looped into a RICO trial, at the time, the longest trial in Georgia history. I think we have to ask if prosecutors are using their weapons in ways that are disproportionate to the harm, and taxpayers are paying top dollar to fund that.
I think what's ironic about this is how RICO has come back to haunt so many, and the through line, it came back to haunt Giuliani, and through Madam Willis, who was not the DA at the time, but used that for the Atlanta public school case. And then now how RICO, some may say the use of it has backfired on her through this YSL case. So I think it really shows how the evolution of the law can come back and bite you in years to come. So I think that's very interesting.
If you don't use it responsibly, it certainly can. And I think a message to law students who want to be prosecutors is be responsible with how you use the awesome power that you're given as a prosecutor. Do your job, have mercy, understand that every time you prosecute, you're making decisions about how to use valuable public dollars that are also needed in other spaces. Be responsible.
That's why I want to ask, why is it acceptable that resources are not given in equal measure to public defender's office? And as citizens, how can we just demand more from our state government that is supposed to provide us with representation, should we not be able to afford it?
I mean, I think the real reason is, as a society, we don't really care about people who live in the margins. We can say we care about it. As an ideal, we care about it. But when it comes down to, are you willing to pay tax dollars for it? We are more motivated by fear than we are by empathy or compassion. We will vote to keep on making more and more conduct a crime when we are told that we have to fear certain conduct, but we won't vote to fund public defenders needed to ensure that people are protected when they're accused of those crimes. And largely the people who are being inspired to pass these draconian laws are not the same population of people who are being impacted when a prosecutor decides to use the weapons they have in a way that is harsh.
And unfortunately, I feel like we're going to go through a time where the defendants are going to look a lot like women who, have lost their right to choose what they want to do with their body. And we're in a time now and where I think it's going to become scarier to become a lawyer. As a professor and teaching a criminal justice program, when this is the case, and when a president-elect has talked about implementing qualified immunity, where does your mind go when you think about the future of criminal defense work in all these different areas and how it's kind of spreading apart? And how do you prepare your law students for that?
So Shay, where my mind goes is to you and to your classmates and to all of you who I think are the hope we have for the future. I mean, anyone who's studied mass incarceration understands that there was a war on drugs implemented in the 70s and 80s and ongoing that fueled mass incarceration, that led to millions of disproportionately Black people, almost exclusively poor people, being incarcerated, being subject to the control of parole and probation, being impacted by civil consequences that kept them from getting jobs or voting or living in government subsidized housing. So I think that the war on drugs led to the first wave of mass incarceration. I worry very much that the Dobbs decision that criminalized reproductive choice, we are going to see a new wave of mass incarceration as prosecutors begin to criminalize the choices that women make, but also the choices that family members of women make when it comes to maybe taking them to a healthcare facility or helping them get access to a morning after pill, right? The ripple effects of prosecutions based on pregnancy-related crimes could be a new wave of mass incarceration. And I think you're insightful to recognize that women are squarely in the crosshairs of that. In other walks of the criminal legal system, women are disproportionately being increasing their representation in the criminal legal system. But this is one area where I think there is going to be a real attack on women and the people who love them and the people who care about them. And so what does that mean for law students? I think that the stakes are just a little bit higher. That again, as law students think about the obligation that we have as lawyers to make this world a better place, we have a unique opportunity to go into spaces where laws are made and enacted and prosecuted and have an impact. And I hope more and more students feel an obligation to enter those spaces and change the course of history. Because if we're indifferent, things are not going to look good for the next generation.
How are you preparing your Gideonites for that? Like the people who are currently in the role and ready to serve these clients?
So this is not new for public defenders. Public defenders, again, I think that America is has always been an example of a huge gap between our ideals and how we actually live. And nowhere is that seen more visibly than in the criminal legal space. So public defenders, since public defenders came along, were in spaces where there were attacks on democracy. There were attacks on rights being applied to people that public defenders represented. So public defenders have always had to work on resisting attempts to undermine democratic ideals, constitutional rights, constitutional principles. So we continue to prepare our lawyers, to understand how to argue the Constitution, to understand how to learn the stories and tell the stories of people who are impacted, and to appreciate that you're not going to be able to eke out justice in every single case. Don't let that defeat you. Find strategies to keep moving forward. And if you're doing that and your colleagues are doing that across the country, and you're all making gains, even if incremental, you're making a difference. We are all part of an ongoing process. It's been 400 years and we're still trying to make this country live up to its aspirations. Public defenders are certainly a part of that.
We'll be right back after this. So Shay, great conversation with Jonathan Rapping, who I don't know if you knew this or not, but within the public defender community is sort of a legend, which I'm sure you knew that, but he is affectionately known as just Rapp. So what were your big takeaways from your conversation with Rapp?
Quite a few. I think the biggest takeaway is that he has a passion for this work still, even though he's, experiences away and years away from that public defender when he first started. He still has the same passion for the work, and he still has the same passion to want to help others realize their greatest potential in helping others. And I think that is amazing that he's found different ways to serve that interest and serve that passion so it doesn't get stale to him.
Shay, I want to butt in here for a second and say that throughout your conversation, I was remembering a lot of the public defenders that I met in the past. And you make a really important point. It's hard to find anybody in the field of law, probably, who's more passionate about their work than public defenders, truly. I remember when I was interning, when I was a judicial intern at the Southern District of Texas, we had a really heavy criminal docket. I was in the Laredo division, and we saw so many defendants who were indigent, who didn't speak English. And I really thought to myself, what would become of a lot of these people if the federal public defender's office didn't exist? They were people who were flung into a system that, I mean, they couldn't even speak English. They couldn't understand what was happening to them fundamentally at the most core level, and they had a whole amazing team of public defenders there who spoke Spanish, who understood the culture, who were deeply, deeply, deeply committed to this cause. And it truly was amazing to see. I remember one specific public defender. She had, in one case, she was representing 11 different material witnesses in a case. And a lot of them were incarcerated in different parts of Texas. And this woman, for this one case, was driving all around Texas or petitioning courts all over the state of Texas just to meet with her 11 different clients. Some of them, their status was unknown. It was uncertain if they were even in the country. And she was here roping this enormous machine just for the sake of representing her 11 indigent clients, And it was truly amazing to watch. Like, anything that you will ever say about public defenders, no one will ever be able to say that they're not the most committed people out there. So as I was listening to your conversation, that was like one of my big takeaways was there's so many people out there who are truly gems, right? And I think one good thing maybe, I mean, I guess it's tough to frame this as a good thing, but one pro of the fact that this is not a high-paying field compared to maybe firm work is that it filters out people who might be going into this kind of work for the wrong reasons. You truly will get the people who are passionate about it, the people who are doing this for the right cause, I suppose.
So that's something, and I think you guys touched on like so many things. I think one that really speaks to the importance of the Gideon v. Wainwright case that Professor Rapping kind of explained and went into. And that's a conversation that we had as well, Manny. Like, is this a great, training ground for people to go to? And something that I think bothers me about our profession, and Todd, you'll remember this from our episode last season when we talked about when the art lawyer has like somehow found his way to fighting, a section of big pharma essentially. And it was something that he never thought he would do. And then the difference between what a villain is kind of in our legal field and what the hero is in our legal field. And how do you classify an attorney as a villain when everyone has this like right to representation, right? So I started to just think about my classmates and just people in general and how we stray so far from having empathy. And I think that a pro to almost making it mandatory for you to either participate in some sort of defense clinic or even prosecution clinic or even get this sort of knowledge under your belt is the people element of it. Because I feel like we lack empathy sometimes in this profession. We lack empathy as a people, but I think sometimes in this profession, we also lack empathy. But to be able to tap into a story like one that you just said, Manny, I think that could bring a little bit of it back. And that would help to change our profession for the better, regardless of where you practice. But I think it is a point to say, well, yes, there are people who probably should stay far away from the defense side of the table. At the same time, I don't necessarily think it is wise to sway people from wanting to do this type of work if it isn't their first inclination to do it, because I also think that you can create and make and form great attorneys who didn't even know that they wanted to do this work if they didn't have the opportunity to be exposed to it. So I play like a fine line with this all the time. It was a ping pong, during this conversation for me. And as I was kind of gearing up to go here, because I do think that we think We think that. We think that, only certain people can be public defenders or only certain people can be prosecutors. And you sway people away from wanting to participate when they probably could be a noble contribution to the profession.
Yeah, I agree. So much of your conversation really centered, I think, one of my big takeaways was the culture, right? So much of this comes down to culture. So much of this comes down to us as a people not recognizing the importance of indigent defense, but wanting to fund prosecutors' offices maybe to a much more disproportionate degree. And I think the big question here comes down to that. How do we change as a people, right? How do we modify this culture? And your conversation also reminded me a little bit of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing, where she was asked about Gideon. And, she mentioned her as a trial judge, the absolute importance, like the constitutional importance to representation. I mean, before Gideon v. Wainwright, the Sixth Amendment was kind of empty. Like the promise of the Sixth Amendment was essentially just, you can hire your own lawyer, sure. That was pretty much it. You had a right to hire a lawyer in court. But this right to effective legal representation, even if you can't afford it, was something really novel and incredible. And so, I mean, I think that's another big point, I think, to emphasize is like the kind of work that public defenders do is deeply important on a constitutional level even.
Manny, I just want to interrupt you because I love that you brought up Justice KGB. I think another thing that we should definitely highlight that she said, during her confirmation was, I have family members in the law and behind bars. And when you have that duality of experience, you're automatically empathetic. So that's just what I continuously cape for, is to have the experience. And I believe me, I know you can't change everyone. You can't impact everyone. You cannot inject everyone with an IV of empathy. But when you can expose them to it in some shape, way, form, or fashion, I advocate for that. And it just brought it back to me. But thank you for bringing that back up.
I had a supervisor who had been a career public defender, and he had said to me, no matter what you do, and this is totally, I found this totally true. He said, no matter what you do rest of your life, you leave this office, no matter how successful you are, how accomplished, no matter how much you like your other job, almost everybody will look back on this experience as the highlight of their professional life. And I think that is in part, for me, it's really true. I love what I do now. I wouldn't change it for anything. It was time to move on and do other things, but I can look back at those 7 years as public defender, and it really was kind of like the highlight of my professional life and everything I know. I mean, you still continue to grow and learn as a lawyer for sure, no matter what. You always do. It's one of the cool parts about the profession. But I can almost say that almost everything I know about being a lawyer, I learned in those 7 years. And that's invaluable.
Todd, did it ever feel like, oh my God, it's 7 years? Were you in year 5, oh my God, it's been 5 years? Or did the time just pass you by because you were learning so much and being exposed to, because I know we've talked about this before, you had different rotations and did different things. So did it ever feel like, oh my God, it's been 5 years? Oh my God, it's been 6 years? Or was it did you appreciate the time while you were in it too?
Yeah, I mean, there's a definite point in it where I knew that there was something else I wanted to do. I got an opportunity while I was at that office to teach a criminal defense clinic at the University of Pennsylvania Law School through that office. Mm-hmm. And then I realized okay, there's something else I want to do and another place I want to transition in. But I never felt like I got to get out of this place. I never felt restless or I never felt bored. I mean, part of it might have been where I was. It was just kind of a really fast-paced, really interesting, dynamic environment to try cases in. So there are always new challenges, but there are always satisfactions you had in working for every client. So I knew it was time to do something. I wanted to do something else, but I never felt like, oh my God, it's been 5 years or 7 years. I can't believe I've been here so long. So I think it was just an amazing experience that if you can afford it, I think it's worth every penny or lack thereof to have that experience. Once again, thanks to Professor Jonathan Rapping. If you want to dig more into the subject, you should head over to gideonspromise.org to learn more about their work or to even get involved. We want to hear more from you on this subject, so share your thoughts with us on the ABA Law Student Division socials or through a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're looking for even more content curated just for you, head over to the ABA Law Student Division website and become a member. And before we go, we'd like to thank our production partners at Moraine Media, and thank you to the ABA Law Student Division for making this show a reality. We'll be back next month with our next episode. See you then.